Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be talking with Kevin Johnson today so that our City Biz audience can learn so much more about the important work he does as the co founder and executive director of Election Reformers Network. ERN's mission is critically important today to help modernize our democratic institutions and to guard against what is a growing polarization in our country. This isn't just a theoretical concept. The Election Reformers Network advances serious research to drive policies to ensure that the institutions running elections are as secure and trustworthy as possible. Voter trust is critical to the functioning of our democracy, and ERN does valuable work in that area that we'll get into later. Kevin is a member of the elections expert study team of the Carter Center and has a vast history in elections, not only in the United States, but around the world. He's co-authored a comprehensive study of the Secretary of State conflict of interests and pioneered an important study on top two proportional approach to the Electoral College. I could go on, but I want to leave as much time as possible to learn from Kevin what is being done and what needs to be done to protect and defend and to create the healthy self-governance that so many of us want. Welcome, Kevin. Thank you for taking the time. Much appreciated.
Great to be with you, David. Thank you for doing these interviews. This is really a great service.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start a little differently than most people I interview because a lot of them don't come from the same background you come from. You got an MBA at the Wharton School, and traditionally, Wharton graduates are trained to go into business and to use those skills to in the entrepreneurial, financial world, marketing world, whatever. What brought you from the Wharton School to the work you do with Election Reformers Network? How did that happen, or was it a step-by-step process?
Yeah, it's a good question, David. Thank you. Actually, I had done a lot of election work before Wharton. I spent the 90s working overseas where new democracies were being formed in Central and Eastern Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, all sort of following the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I can say more about that experience. It was absolutely amazing. I did that for about 9 years and then decided I would try the profit sector, and I segued through Wharton and started my own company. But I think I was always sort of motivated by this experience I had with that prior work, and frankly, my private sector work, reaffirmed, which was sort of two major lessons about the United States and its position in the world. And that first lesson was American democracy still has this incredible symbolism that has driven people to strive for freedom around the world. And it's real and it's happening, and we have to protect that. And my second learning is the structure of American democracy has fallen way behind the best practices of our peers, and we really need to change that. So ERN came out of that learning, my prior work, some work post-Wharton, and I also partnered with a lot of folks that I had worked with overseas. And we put together an organization to kind of protect the best of American democracy and make the changes where we were behind.
Do you think the polarization that exists, that seems to be amplified in the last 4, 5, 6 years, is disruptive to your work, makes your work more difficult, or is it just a part of the process and nothing's really changed as a result of the partisanship?
The polarization is a huge factor. I would say it makes our work more important. Yes, it makes it more difficult, but that's kind of irrelevant. The polarization is the major problem confronting the United States right now. And it's polarization that's exacerbated by some old rules. And that's really a lot of our focus is on changing those old rules. And I think if you understand kind of the transition in our party system, decades ago, the two parties found ways to work together. They don't anymore. And that has driven this kind of ideological separation where we just have nothing but animosity now between the two parties. And that really exacerbates the old structures, legacy structures that are in our system that we haven't updated. And that I was referencing before when I said we've sort of been leapfrogged by other democracies who figured out better ways to structure parties and structure systems to avoid that kind of division.
Well, tell me, if, in your own personal opinion, what are some of those old rules that you think are impeding the healthy self-governance that our democratic republic should strive for? Are there one, two, or three that come to mind most?
Yeah, sorry, the three that really come to mind. And two of them have to do with parties having too much control of how elections work. And that has to do with gerrymandering, right? Which is when legislatures do the mapping for districts. And that's really controlled by the political parties that have the majority in the legislature. No other country does it that way. Every other democracy that has a similar system sets up an independent commission to draw those lines. We're starting to catch up on that now. 4 states have established that kind of independent commission. 2 more may establish them in the future. We do a lot of work in that area. So that's one example. Another example is that we have partisan bodies that play a lot of roles in the governance and management of elections. And that can be, party nominated groups that certify results on the back end to partisan elected secretaries of state kind of on the oversight level to election management that is run by pairs of Democrats and Republicans. Again, no other system in the world does this. And it gives the insiders too much control over elections, and it reduces trust in elections. The third that I'd mention is less to do about party control, and it has to do with the rules of voting. And you've probably had other guests who've talked about ideas like the top 2 primary approach or the top 4 or 5 primary approach. Those changes would get at, a legacy structure that we have that a lot of other countries have moved beyond. It's a structure that exacerbates our polarization.
Well, that's all fascinating. I'm going to ask you a question I ask a lot of the people I interview. But this one, in terms of full disclosure, I have to tell everybody that I sort of know what the answer is. The question I ask many of the people I interview is, the work you just spoke of, everything you just spoke of is a long-term process. It's not going to take a week or a year. It's something we have to think more longer term. But I ask many people, is the situation now with this election in November, the uniqueness of the potential impact this election could have, the questions of election security and trust in the election process, does that change your focus at all? And the reason I know to an extent that you are thinking short term on this particular issue, the full disclosure is that the Bridge Alliance that I'm co-founder of is proud to be a partner with ERN in a election overtime project. Could you give it a little explanation to our City Biz audience as to what that project's all about and how it fits into the importance of the trust in elections for the democratic process?
Yeah, really happy to do so, David, and so proud to be working with you on this project. I'm really excited about it. Basically, the Election Overtime Project has as its core assumption that most things are working really well about our voting system, but people and reporters don't understand that well enough. So the key is to get the information, particularly to reporters, so that they can do a better job explaining what the safeguards are and the protections are in our system that should enable voters to be confident that our system can generate trustworthy results. We're doing that in 6 battleground states, and we're doing that with a focus that's really emphasizes, the notion of the overtime, an election that's really close and contested. And in some of the battleground states, that's going to be what happens. And what I mean by contested is one side feels so aggrieved that it takes to court. It basically challenges the results in court. That's kind of the most challenging dynamic any democracy can have, We experienced it in 2020. We've experienced it in prior elections. The good news that people don't know well enough is that the rule of law is ready. States have systems in place that are able to handle these kinds of challenges, that give challenging parties their right to present evidence and explain what happened, and use courts, the best entity that we have to render judgment on these things, give courts the role of assessing that evidence and coming with conclusions. That is the way that close elections should be dealt with and should be understood from a country that is grounded in the rule of law. We need our news coverage and our social media discussion and our voter kind of conversation to be focused and anchored in that rule of law process, not the, in the streets debate, not the social media debate, not the conspiracy debate. None of that is real in the sense of the actual process that will determine who wins. We need to refocus on that real process. And I am thrilled to be working with you on that, because your insight into the journalistic processes and the way in which reporters are thinking about these issues, and our insight into kind of this anchoring in the rule of law, makes a perfect combination to have a lot of impact in that program. Really looking forward to it.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I'm curious as to your insights as to, most of what you're talking about is democracy reform and how it functions and that aspect of a democracy. But a lot of our polarization is cultural in nature. We have a cultural divide in our country. Does your work intersect with that at all? Do you see the bridging part of the movement, finding common ground, a separate part of the process, or are they deeply connected?
I actually disagree a little bit with the assumption that the polarization is culturally grounded. And I think you can look at a lot of other countries that have the kind of social ingredients of polarization, but are less polarized than we. For example, if you just go north across the border, Canada, in addition to being a big diverse country like ours, it has a language divide. There's a minority that speaks French, and majority that speaks English. And if you look internationally, language divides are one of the key sources of like civil war and major disunion. But there's a lot less polarization there. And I would argue that a lot of that has to do with those structural things we talked about before. They have a voting system that has enabled a centrist third party. That party creates an alternative so that the two sides aren't just fighting against each other. They have independent redistricting. They have independent election administration. So the parties can kind of back out of fighting in the election rule arena, and instead they can compete on their ideas and leadership. That's really our vision, in a sense, for the United States, is that the parties should be in the role of sharing their ideas and their leadership, and leave the role of controlling elections to election professionals. And that's what happens in other countries. And I think that has a lot to do with why places that have the ingredients for social kind of division aren't as divided as we are.
Well, that's quite interesting.
It's a different way of thinking about it than most people have. But
Yeah, I think I'll have to ponder that a little. It is a different approach. I wonder if you run into this problem at all. Obviously, we're both deeply involved in the democracy movement, but so many business people, they don't want to get involved. Either they're afraid that they're going to be typecast in some way, or I get this a lot. There's nothing that ever will change. There's too much power in the duopoly of the Democrat and Republican Party, and you're just wasting your time. Since we have so many business leaders out there listening to this through City Biz, what could you say to them, or what would you say to them that might convince them that they're not wasting their time, that change can be made, that their wisdom that they've learned through business experiences can actually make a difference? Any thoughts on that?
So it's a really great question, and it's challenging for business leaders to figure out how to position themselves. There has been backlash on some business leaders who got involved in advocating for certain kinds of election reform and that kind of thing. I think, that was unfortunate and exaggerated, but that has scared some away. But I really think it's important that for business leaders to recognize how valuable this is to them, that our polarization reduces and that we go back to a normal way of functioning. We're a country that has not passed a budget under normal order in decades. We have this outrageous national debt. We have no political will to kind of deal with those problems. All of those issues have huge implications for the business sector. So kind of standing aside is not really an option. And I think the angle that businesses can take is to leverage the things that make our economy and our markets work so well. And those are rule of law elements, particularly rule of law as regards conflict of interest. The difference between the way markets police conflict of interest versus the way that gets policed in elections is amazing. We allow people who run elections to give funding to candidates running in the election underneath them. I mean, it's an amazing sort of sloppiness in system that we would never allow on the market side. So I think business leaders can advance some of these changes that don't help one side or the other, but just give the structure its kind of deeper level of integrity. And that in turn can help solidify this system and prevent it from continuing to have the shocks that I think are really detrimental to business.
And how would that conflict of interest on the election side of it, those running the elections, be eliminated? Would it be through individual state legislative action? Would it be national congressional action? How is that process? How would it actually work?
Well, I think it's an area for state legislation. We've done some model bill drafting, for example, that would prohibit secretaries of state or county clerks from taking a position in an election that they oversee, whether that position would be endorsing a candidate or funding a candidate. That's consistent with the kind of prohibitions that are in the Hatch Act around public employees and their role vis-a-vis politics. So it would be consistent with current Supreme Court decisions regarding appropriate limitations on freedom of speech. So those are the kinds of, and then the other changes would be structural. The whole idea of an independent redistricting commission is to end the conflict of interest that happens when the legislator draws his own district and giving that district to a completely independent commission so that there isn't that conflict of interest.
You've worked with so many great organizations internationally over the years. Were there any great inspirational leaders that have inspired you, that you've learned lessons from, that could help us all as we view the problems we face?
Absolutely. Jimmy Carter and the Carter Center has been an incredible inspiration for me. I had the opportunity to work directly with President Carter in a couple of different overseas programs, including in the West Bank and Gaza, for example, which was really kind of an amazing experience, and also several countries in Africa. He is a real inspiration in the way in which he sort of embodies this personal integrity that he brings to kind of the work of bridging divides and negotiating differences and finding a way forward in conflict situations. Interestingly, his experience comes from having had his first election stolen from him. He wrote a book called The Tipping Point that describes the first time he ran for state senate in Georgia. And there's a chapter in the book called The Dead Voted Alphabetically. And it's a great book to understand the old days and the old ways of machine politics and what that meant. And he promised Rosalind he would never run again if he didn't win that one, but he was able to find the lawyers to take the case, that could find the judges that were not part of the machine and that would hear the case, and his stolen election was overturned. He went to the Georgia Senate and then on to the governor and on from there. So it's a rule of law story, but it's also a real story about the problems that we've had historically in our country.
That is a great story, and it relates to the election overtime project that we have some trust in our courts quite often, and most often it works out. Well, one more question, and then we'll end this great conversation. If so much of the work you are doing were achieved in the next 5, 6, 10 years, how would that impact Americans' lives? I mean, why is it important in the day-to-day lives of Americans who don't think about democracy every day like we do?
It's a good question. And I would summarize the answer in the concept that was so important to the founders, which is country above party. I think if the changes that we are working on at ERN got adopted, people would see that this system really is run by people who are not trying to help one side win. They're just trying to make things work for the country. And if you think, we do talk a lot in terms of sports analogies, people are confident in the way, championship games, Super Bowl, etc. They're confident that the referees are going to do the best they can to call those events fairly. Yeah, there's human mistakes. They might miss something here or there, but the system isn't rigged. It would tremendously change the perception of the citizens of the United States if they had that exact same confidence about everything in our democracy. And they don't right now, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, Kevin. An insightful conversation. I hope it inspires everybody listening, or at least a large percentage of those listening, to realize that they too can make a difference and they need to get involved. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Kevin.
Thank you.